Bro, what's up? Booyakasha!
Kuya ka siya.
What's up, bro?
What's
Bro.
up?
Yeah.
Sabi mo yung buya ka siya, naalala ko yung old character ni
Ali
Sacha
G.
Baron Cohen,
Ali
si
G,
Ali G.
bro. Next time,
Check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yeah! That's it! Oh, man. That's it. We got it. That's it, bro. Dapat meron tayong show na ganun, bro. Comedy show para Axis of Evil type. Di ba? Oh, man. You're the best.
Wala na.
Lelo Claudio, good to join you again, bro.
Oh, miss na kita. Kamusta? Kasakit ka last week.
I know, bro.
Okay ka
Apparently,
na?
I pushed it. Nag-vlogger effect ako. Nagsagada to Coron. Tapos, pa-vlogger, drone. Wala na. Pag uwi na, back to business. Hindi na pala wala na
Nag-crash
internet.
ang katawan ni Kuya.
Hindi na 20s. Hindi na 20s. Speaking of 20s, bro, mukhang may pag-usapan tayong 70s and 80s ba shortly?
Sure, oo.
Yun. So bro, obviously just to get the ball rolling, Maharlika is once again in the house, right? Literally in the house, and medyo napunta na kay Junior and he's about to sign it and all. Now, the Maharlika thing we already discussed it, in a separate episode. So hindi na natin ulitin yan, corny masyado. But obviously the Maharlika debate is going in many directions, and recently the UP School of Economics released a paper, kind of a position paper, which makes me kind of deja vu of all the previous position papers, including position papers that came after the collapse of the Marcos dictatorship. But you were telling me before we go back to the Maharlika issue that there are other important facts and data about the Marcos era na siguro dapat balikan natin, because in a way it was also referenced by a UP School of Economics paper also in the past. So is there something you want to share, bro?
Yeah, bro. So I recommend that the best, and I don't claim to have written the best assessment of the Marcos regime economically. I'm not capable of doing so. The best one is still yung paper ni Professor Noel de Dios et al. So called Martial Law and the Philippine Economy by Emmanuel S. de Dios, Maria Socorro Gochoco Bautista, and JC Punong Bayan. So napakagaling ng paper na yun. I think it's very even-handed. I think it gives you a great assessment of the Marcos regime from multiple angles. Most of the data there is based on the work of Raymond not Raymond Bonner, an economist named Donner, and a really underrated economist named Ponzano et al., who's actually my favorite economic historian.
I read their works. I read the original work. We quoted him in one of our earlier. I used the graph.
Si Professor Intal, recipes, one of the great underrated economic historians na talagang yan. And then the other data, yung kind of raw data that they mostly worked on was yung World Bank data. And laki talaga ng World Bank data. It allows you a comparative perspective. There's one data set na mukhang hindi nila ganun nilaro. And hindi ko alam bakit hindi nilalaro ng mga tao. I guess because medyo mas obscure siya. Pero I was just playing around in the internet the other day.
Because you look for obscure stuff. That's what you do, right?
That you can also play around with. And it is the UNCTAD data set. So I guess, Richard, you know this better than me. What's UNCTAD like?
Yeah, so this UNCTAD one, the history behind that, I mean, you can check the acronym yourself. It's a specific United Nations body
United Nations Conference on Trade and Development.
So it was a conference, right? So the context of that was you're talking about the early efforts by developing countries, no? And one of the key figures was, of course, Prebisch, so Latin American economists. This is a time that they were saying we should improve our terms of trade with the developed world. And one of the things we have to do is to invest in what would be called import substitution industrialization, or ISI. No? So that was the context. The good thing is that even if hindi na uso yung ISI, na lost na yung ISI, there's a lot of criticism of how it went wrong, because you had kind of a sprinkling of manufacturing in all across the developing world, but it really just worked in a few countries, no, and especially in the case of Korea, Japan, etc. But those are more supposed export-oriented industrialization cases. Nevertheless, UNCTAD has survived up to this day, and honestly, I also rely a lot on UNCTAD for a lot of data, including, for instance, the impact of decoupling from China, the impact of evolution in supply chains, not to mention yung potential impact of artificial intelligence. So hanggang ngayon, UNCTAD for me is one of the best sources to get comparative data, no, especially against around developing country on really metrics that you and I care about, manufacturing, productivity, etc. So when you mentioned you would look at some raw data by UNCTAD, it immediately said, oh, ping, something went off in my mind. I was like, wow, there must be something interesting there, right?
So ang data na binibigay nila, which I didn't find in the World Bank, is data on real per capita GDP growth. Now let's break that down why it's so important. GDP growth is yung paglago ng ekonomiya. And mostly, yung nakikita natin is yung nominal GDP. In other words, gaano kabilis lumaki yung ekonomiya ng Pilipinas as a whole.
Constant dollars, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, constant. Now, that's a good indicator for yung just absolute strength ng economy. Pero how does it filter down? Because there are things that compound that. So for example, kung lumaki yung population mo, di syempre yung division ng paglaki na yun is, it gets more complicated, right?
Mas maraming slice.
Mas maraming slice.
Mas maraming
the pie has to be divided into more parts, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's one thing you have to correct for, right? And there was a very interesting debate, hindi ko na papasukin. Well, medyo inaway ni JC Punong Bayan, and I think JC was right to call him out. Gerardo Sica, who delivered a lecture on the Marcos economy. Na medyo nga, of course, defending Marcos economy. And JC rightfully called him out, saying that Sica was so dependent on nominal GDP and didn't look at yung capita, right? So tama si JC doon. But there's another.
Did JC also call you out on the nominal real issue, right? Let's be honest. That's how it started, right? Remember in the other year, like he said, if you look at the real growth numbers or something, real wage growth, right? I think real wage.
Yeah, wage naman yun.
And
then the other thing that and of course JC, this I think JC would also call out Sikat here is yung idea of inflation as eating into GDP growth, right? So that's another factor you need to correct for. So in that sense, if you want to correct for those two things, the best criteria is real GDP per capita growth, because real means corrected for inflation, per capita means per person, so corrected for population. So kung tinignan mo yun,
exactly.
Kung tinignan mo yung mga factors na yun, and of course I'm not an economist, even if ibigay mo sa akin yung GDP, yung population, yung GDP, at saka yung inflation rate, hindi ko kayang computein yun on my own. Okay, I'm just not an economist in that sense. I'm dabbling in economic history. But the UNCTAD does that for you, and you can play around with it. And the comparisons are wonderful because you can compare with other parts of the world. You can compare with the world as a whole.
Right.
You can do that in aggregate. So ito na, I am going to share with you.
Let's go. This is it.
I'm going to share with you what you find if you start playing around. And I encourage people to do this on their own. Just play around with the UNCTAD data. Ayan. So what I'm going to do, bro, is I'm going to break down the Marcos regime into three parts really, because you have to start with 65. Pero for our purposes lang, because hindi ko naman, ayoko naman ipakita lahat ng data, abutin tayo siyam dito. Breakdown lang natin to the 70s and the 80s. Bakit 70s and 80s?
So the first one is 1971 to 1979.
Yeah, okay. Actually the stats start in 1971. I would have preferred to start in 1970, pero wala kang 1970. So so it starts at 1971, and actually the data will take you up until 2021. So if you wanna move it forward and say compare the Marcos regime based on the same indicators, and say the Aquino regime, Aquino 2 regime, kaya mong gawin yun kasi it brings you up to 2021. So it's kind of really amazing in that sense. But for our purposes today, breakdown lang natin into two parts, yung 70s at yung 80s. Why 70s and 80s? Because it's good to look at the 70s, because 71 to 79, that is the period after the depreciation of after the secular or long-term depreciation of the peso, right? Until 79. And then roughly from 71 until 79, ang piso mo naglalaro from, 640 to 7.1. So medyo wala ka ganong variation dyan.
Right.
And then of course 1980, the peso, the peso, but not just the peso, everything crumbles in 1980 and 1981 because of the third world debt crisis. So it's good to take it in two parts. And then the other reason why it's good to take it in two parts is because by the 1980s, iba na yung political circumstances mo. The technocrats are no longer as much in power as they were in the 1970s. Some people would say na ito na yung ascendancy Imelda. Nagkakasakit na si Apo Lakay, di ba? So wala na siya ganong control. And then you have the Aquino crisis. So I think just for parang intellectual coherence, and I think fairness then, it's good to break it down into these two phases. So let's look at yung 70s muna. Okay, let's start with the favorite. This is the UNCTAD data, but just to kind of contextualize this UNCTAD data, let's look at World Bank data first. And this World Bank data, more or less ginamit na to ng UP Econ paper, but I'm looking at the World Bank data differently. So this is your 70s.
When you say UP Econ paper, this is not the Abuevo one. This is the De Jos one, right?
The Jos one. So I don't think they made a graph like this, but may similar graph. And I want to start here because when people remember the 70s, they think about the 70s as a period of inflation, and largely this is because of the writings of I guess people like what's his name, Lee Chauco and other people and other left-wing economists of nationalist economists of the 70s and 80s. So merong inflation ng 1970s because in 1970, 1969, 1970. Marcos spent a lot of money to get re-elected. But even prior to that, he was spending a lot of money on classroom social services. So talagang nag-expand yung money supply mo. And because nag-expand yung money supply mo, nagkakaroon ka talaga ng crunch in terms of foreign reserves. In other words, bumababa yung foreign reserves mo. So what the IMF recommended at that time was for you to depreciate the peso from around 3.6 to around 6. Ganyan. Ayaw ni Marcos ito initially until pumasok si Virata. And Virata had been pro-depreciation since 1949. Na-interview ko si Virata. Wow. Yes, it was the IMF position, but also it was a position of Virata that he'd held since 1949. And of course, hindi lang naman IMF ang nag-advocate ng depreciation. I mean, if for people who've read my work, I traced the origins of yung depreciation discourse to 1950 with the nationalist left-wing economist Salvador Araneta. So yes, it was an IMF decision.
Wait, so Virata was also for depreciation for similar reason to make us more export-oriented manufacturing.
Yeah. And sabi niya he made the plan in 1949 as a college student. So college student pa lang siya, naniniwala siya doon. So anyway, so Virata comes in 1970, comes in early February 1970. And the Central Bank Monetary Board meeting was in February 21. Right. I think on February 20, he asks Marcos, "Sir, I want to depreciate. But sir, yayariin tayo ng kalaban natin kasi depreciation is inflationary. But in the long term, it's good because it will benefit our foreign reserves. Tataas yung foreign reserves natin dahil mas mag-export pa tayo. Sir, can you do this?" And sabi ni Marcos daw kay Virata, "Cesar, do it. And I'll take care of the political fallout." And if you talk to Virata, this is the moment he realizes, I'm going to be loyal to this man because he's willing to make the hard decisions and insulate.
Political will show.
So this is Virata's story, okay? You can disagree with it, whatever. I'm just telling it from Virata's perspective. So anyway, 69 to 70, this is when the depreciation, so pataas yan kasi ito electoral spending yan, di ba? Election year yan. Talagang gumasos si Marcos dito, lumaki yung money supply, nagkaroon ng inflationary pressures. That's 69 to 70. And then another inflation was 1970 when you depreciate the peso.
You're comparing with Thailand and Indonesia as our two peers.
Tumaas ulit yung inflation until 1971. It kind of peaks. So this is the depreciation, whatever, the Virata effect, if you like. But then,
Pirata shock, no? Parang culture shock. Pirata shock.
let's call it the Virata shock.
Yeah.
And then 1972, pababa na siya. So meaning it's really just a shock, and then there was a kind of stabilization. Now look at what happens from 72 to 73, and ito in many ways ito
Oh,
talaga ang
shocks na
the
yan.
biggest
Oh,
challenge
full shocks
ng
na yan.
Marcos regime is
Yeah.
1973 to 1974. Richard, what's 1973 to 1974?
So you're talking about the Arab-Israeli wars and all, right? So
And
this
the oil shock, 'di ba? The oil shock,
yes,
the
became
oil
part
shock,
of
yung
yung
oil shock
Arab
na
countries.
talagang tumaas ang global oil prices.
Right.
So clearly what's happening here is that it has nothing to do with depreciation anymore, 'di ba?
It's an
Because
external
this
shock. It's like Ukraine.
external shock na to, and how do we know it's an external shock? Well, look at the graphs for our neighbors, right? So what I want to say here
Indonesia,
is
no?
that the
What's
19
happening in Indonesia? Sorry to cut you, but for me, I'm surprised with the Indonesia case because Indonesia used to be, I think, at this point, still a net oil exporting country. Remember, Indonesia also has oil resources,
oh
but
nga, no?
so yeah, yun nga, like I'm wondering why Indonesia was not in position to better insulate itself. Considering it was still a kind of an oil exporting country back then, diba? Yeah, I'm just putting that into context, bro. I think that's an interesting.
That's true. That's true. And I don't know how to answer that, bro.
Interesting. I'll
We'll
look
think
into that.
about that.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Go ahead.
So, I guess the conclusion I want to make here is if you look at the historical record, that maraming protest nung panahon na yan, 'di ba? Yan yung talagang ito first quarter storm to, 'di ba?
Right.
And the protests happened because of inflation. And you know what this graph says is that the 1970s were an inflationary period. But the 1970s were an inflationary period. Ang mali dito, the 1970s were an inflationary period, not necessarily because of the technocrats. The biggest inflation is still externally induced.
So just to put it on, we're looking at, sorry, for people who cannot see, so audience, so we're looking at around 34% inflation at the height of the oil crisis. I think Yom Kippur War, oil crisis, but in Indonesia it's at 40%, so 5% more. Thailand is at around 24-25%. So it's pretty horrible for all of us in the ASEAN region, no? Just to put things into context. Siguro if may Malaysia tayo, I could better compare it to Indonesia because Malaysia is even more export-oriented oil.
I'll factor it in.
Yeah.
Pero by 1975, our inflation rate is kind of drops to the level of Thailand. So the third observation I want to make is that it's an inflationary period for everyone, diba? This has been called the 1970s has been called a great inflation. So again, if we just kung iisipin lang natin siya as domestic crisis, kasalanan ng technocrats, part of it is this is really technocrat Marcos driven, and you had to do this because Marcos was corrupt in the 1969 election.
Right.
So yeah, that's part of the story, but the greater story is the global story. Okay, so that actually our inflation is comparable to our neighbors.
Interesting.
Now, the story I really want to look at now is how does that inflation affect our growth? Kasi we said that real GDP growth per capita already factors in inflation, diba? So how much did inflation eat into our per capita growth? So let's look at the years again, 1971 to 1979, prior to the third world debt crisis. Ito yung real GDP per capita growth rate per year. So you can look at it. And what I did was I just compared Philippine growth with the world, Asia, Southeast Asia, and developing economies. If you look at our final rate there, that's 3.27. So that's not so. I found a U.S. Embassy document that said in 1979 the Philippines has posted something like decent but unremarkable growth.
Right.
And I think that's absolutely the accurate way to categorize what the technocrats did. Decent but unremarkable growth, because we are
way behind the curve in our region,
practically equal to the developing world, to the growth of the developing world, behind Southeast Asia, practically equal to Southeast Asia, and then ahead of the world, because of course we're growing faster than the rest of the world, because i-factor in mo na dyan yung low growth, for example, ng other OECD countries, and then of course low growth
sila to begin with.
Ng mayaman, yung low growth sobrang hirap at yung low growth ng mayaman na, di ba? So obviously above the world tayo. So I think, di ba, would you agree with me that based on this, the categorization for yung record ng technocrats is solid but unremarkable. I think that's the best way to
Yeah, I mean, so
categorize.
3.2% is better than, I don't know, much of Latin America or Africa, but it's quite lower than 4.6% for ASEAN region, right? So it depends how you want to look at it. So if you're looking at was Marcos a golden era? Doesn't look like a 3.2, way lower than 4. But was it like a runaway disaster? Not really. Like it's not like 1%. It's not like -%, right? And 70s was a crazy era. A few years was lost because of the oil crisis. I was surprised, and like Indonesia as an oil producing country was so badly hit. Inflation was bad, but worse was Indonesia, and Philippines was a bit higher than Thailand. I see what you're saying. Like what you're saying is that our technocrats were not as horrible as people thought. The argument though would be
they're not brilliant though.
Decently mediocre, decent, but did they prepare us for the 1980s, or did they or does this data hide the disaster that is about to come in the 1980s?
Okay,
I'm playing the devil's advocate here, bro. I'm just saying.
Yung next graph.
Okay, let's go.
Titignan natin yun. Pero let's make a couple of comments
but I
about
like
this.
what we're doing here. I appreciate what you're doing, bro. Because demonization of the technical.
Let's make a couple of comments about it. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, bro.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So mag-comment lang ako ng konti dito sa data na to. A couple more comments. Kitang-kita mo yung oil crisis, talagang totoo naman, inflation ate into our growth, di ba, 1974?
Correct.
Pero even at that rate, hindi pa rin nag-negative, no? So actually, it's interesting, hindi pa rin nag-negative. So it's kinda, it's not bad. And then, I just want to compare this with internal data sa Pilipinas. Because di ko na pinakita yung 1960s, but based on a separate data set, which is also really real GDP growth per capita, na nahanap ko sa data ni the late Dodon Paderanga. Itong growth rate natin in the 70s was 58% higher than the growth rate in the 60s. 58% higher. So, in other words, it's a real change from the growth rate ng 60s. For 58% higher. And then if you compare this internally sa Pilipinas, you project forward, the only time we will achieve 3.2 average growth rate again is the first decade of the 2000s. And then we overtook that growth rate from 2015 onwards, essentially during the late Aquino, early Duterte time. Right? So in recent history, this was our highest rate until Noynoy and Digong.
Yeah, but obviously
so, ang tumalo lang yan si Noynoy. Bro, hindi kita marinig. Anong nangyari?
Sir.
Pause tayo, sorry.
It's at a higher base, diba?
Wait lang.
1 second. No, I'm just saying, one thing you have to keep in mind is that we're operating from a higher base.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, bro.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Oh, that's weird.
Sorry.
What's going on? I should be fine. Now, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I'm gonna try this.
1 second.
Bro.
Now, can you hear me?
Ayun. Oh, yeah, I can hear you. So, ito na. Okay.
Yeah. So I was saying, well, of course, I mean, let's put into context na across decades, we're looking at different base, diba? So medyo 3,000 pataas na tayo over the past 10 years. My suspecha is we're talking about just $1,000 barely, no? During the Marcos era.
Hindi, bro, kasi ano yan eh? Kasi percentage growth yan eh.
No, I know, but what I see a total there. Is that what is that? Kasi
ay, sorry, ignore mo na lang yung total na yan.
Parang, kasi I'm looking at what was the per capita period. Like, what was the nominal?
Itong total na yan lang yung total nitong years na to.
So, it doesn't make sense.
Pinang-compute ko lang ng average yan, sorry. I should have hidden that. What's most important is yung average, sorry. So, walang absolute numbers dito. So actually, these are all growth rates. In other words, yung rates. So, wala tayong pakialam kung anong absolute kasi obviously lumalaki yung absolute. so it's interesting that if you look at the rates, we only see these rates again in this is 58% higher than the rates in the 60s, and then we only see similar rates of growth from 2000 to 2010, essentially Arroyo period. This is actually a close mirror, interestingly enough. This is almost a mirror of the growth rates under GMA.
But at a higher base, no? But at a higher base, I suppose.
Higher base, of course, kasi cumulative naman yung umakyat yan. So,
yeah,
rate lang naman yung pinag-uusapan.
2,000 na yung per capita natin kay GMA. Siguro 2.4. No, mga ganun. Twice what we have. Yeah, I'm just, putting things into context now. Do we have the 1980s numbers? You want to look at that? Just to...
Eto na. So, ito ang...
Talaga.
Dito talaga tayo sinunog ni Makoy, brother. And I am actually providing more comparison here. Because again, because when you look at the 1980s, it's no longer just you can't think about it as an Asia thing. You have to think about it as a third world debt crisis, diba? It's called La Decada Perdida or the Lost Decade. Kasi tinamaan talaga is yung Latin American countries. So what I've done here is I have put in data from Southeast Asia, but also Latin American countries. And yung napakalinaw dito is that the 1980s were really horrible for us.
Zoom that a bit, bro. Sorry, my eyes is not as good as before. You want to zoom that a bit?
Yeah, ayan. Kaya pa?
Yeah,
medyo marami.
Negative 9% in 1984. That's crazy, bro. I see a 0.6 negative. Is that 9 na dalawa? Okay, so 84, 85 was just insane, off the charts.
Talagang dinurog talaga tayo ng 84 and 85. Wasak talaga tayo nitong third world debt crisis. So, I mean, the third world debt crisis was bad for the developing world. And you can see the numbers here din naman sa developing world.
Yeah.
The developing world is doing negative. Marami ring negative ang developing world as a whole dyan. So it really is a third world debt crisis. And if you look at Latin America, of course, tingnan mo negative ang Latin America as a whole, right?
Yeah, bro, but tingnan mo naman yung 2% ng developing, negative 9 ng Philippines. Parang that's like a 9%, 11% differential, bro. That's double digit.
But here's the thing. You're right. And then compared to Southeast Asia, nakakahiya tayo.
Nakakahiya
talaga tayo because if you look at Southeast Asia, it withstood the third world debt crisis. So at a growth rate of negative 1.9, who are we comparable with? We are most comparable with Guatemala, Argentina, Cambodia, Nicaragua. So essentially, in the 1980s, our economy did not behave like a Southeast Asian economy. It behaved like a Latin American economy.
Just to be fair, Cambodia, may mga civil war pa sila, may Indochina. So I want to take out Cambodia from that kasi special case yan. So we're really more Latin America, yeah.
Tsaka itong Brunei na to, I think this has to do with oil prices.
Yeah, I mean, they're super rich. Even they go negative 50%, they're still rich. Like,
yung Brunei na yan, I think that has to do with oil.
It's the oil fluctuations, oil price.
So the question is, why were we not battered like our Southeast Asian neighbors? Like no. First and foremost, it's not true that Southeast Asia was not battered. If you look at Indonesia, for instance,
correct.
May nag-negative din sila. And in fact, I think Minister of Finance Sumitro called it the greatest malaise that the modern Indonesian economy had ever seen since the 50s. They were already panicking. Even Indonesia was panicking. Except yung extent is really not comparable to what happened in the Philippines.
Right.
So, ang conclusion ni Professor De Dios is essentially, mas kurakot yung Pilipinas compared to its other neighbors. At mas mahilig mangutang si Marcos compared to
so the growth
neighbors.
Model was problematic.
Yeah. And I had another chart for this. Hindi ko na baka hanapin ko. Totoo nga naman na lahat ng mundo nangutang, but we were really borrowing at rates comparable to Latin American countries. Hence nag-Latin America. And then of course, when the crisis happened, ang bailouts natin were really directed towards Marcos crony industries. So yung Cuencas were some of the biggest beneficiaries of the bailouts under Marcos at this time. So dito talaga na-expose yung corruption kasi when you're doing when your crony companies are not doing are doing okay, you don't really need to bail them out. But when they're going to shit, that's when you bail them out. But the other, so I think Professor De Jos is absolutely correct. But there is one thing that he didn't point out. Why were we so different? And why did I highlight 83, 84 to 85? What's that, pare? These are the worst years of the crisis, but of the economic crisis. But that coincides with the worst years of what?
84, 85. I mean, there was a lot going on. There was also war in the Middle East. What are you looking at?
83, 84, 85. Diyan tayo nag-negative. Actually, if you look at 80, 81,
like Ninoy,
82.
You're talking about Ninoy's assassination?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
so 80, 81,
yeah,
82.
Political
Yeah.
yeah.
So ito yung isa pang kwento dyan. 80, 81, 82. If we are actually not so bad. 80, 81, 82. We're still comparable. And then we really go to shit after Ninoy dies. Di ba? So dito tayo nag-negative eh. Ito yun, no? These are the height of the political crisis.
Nag-confluence din, no? Kasi yung death crisis, political crisis, parang perfect storm. Yeah.
So ang conclusion ko dito is that, why did we behave like a Latin American country? For four reasons. Number one, tama si Professor De Jos. Kurakot talaga si Marcos. Kasi binailout niya, in a time of crisis, ang binailout yung crony companies. Pangalawa, tama rin sina JC at sina Professor De Jos, mas malaki lang talaga yung utang lahat naman may utang, pero mas malaki lang talaga yung utang natin. So hindi masama mangutang, pero kung nangutang ka to the extent of Marcos, you need to think twice. Pangatlo, at ito yung hindi nila gano'n na point out, yung political crisis, yung pagkapatay ni Ninoy. There was a real Ninoy Aquino effect on yung ekonomiya natin.
Can you explain that? Are you talking about civil disobedience? Are you talking about shutting down of sectors of the economy?
I don't know. I think.
Yeah, what's the
Is it possible na capital flight? It's also possible na that other banks were charging higher interest rates.
Are we that like dependent on foreign investments and money inflow in terms of
but also rates, diba? Parang baka mas we need to look at this. Parang
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like it's I mean, it heuristically makes sense, but I just think we have to substantiate that connection, no? How the political crisis paralyzed the economy or reinforced the impending breakdown of the economy as the debt crisis was also taking hold, no? But definitely there's a perfect storm element of them coming together.
Yeah. Tapos, I mean, isipin mo pa, bro, yan yung nagkakasakit na si Marcos, diba? May lupus na raw siya, si Imelda na raw yung in control, right? And if there is a political crisis, you feel mo that the economy is not stable, I mean, you're not gonna, tataasa mo yung interest rates mo kasi delikado, baka gumuho yung gobyerno, diba? And a government that collapses can't pay its debts. So if you're gonna lend money to it, right? Even domestically, right? Kailangan tataasan mo yung interest rates. So one might even, one way to assess whether or not this is partly politically induced is maybe just to look at how much are local bonds being sold during this time, right? Because that might be an indicator, right? So I just found this week, and I haven't dug into what's happening actually concretely economically after namatay si Ninoy. But I really do think that if you see like a tumble na ganyang kalala, it is impossible for me to not think that Ninoy's death had nothing to do with that, diba? So anyway, this is what I've been working on, Richard. I think it's interesting, and I think it allows for great comparison.
Thank you for me, bro. I mean, of course, it's also the classic J curve, no? I mean, once things look stable when the big boy or big man is in control, but as soon as the big man is not there and there's like a, what I'm saying, there's like a vacuum. The instability factor explodes, no, and affects the economy and all of that, no. So there's a huge dip until there is steady democratization and all. Okay, so we're definitely dito dun sa secret.
Yeah.
So gumano.
Tsaka sabi mo rin, I think you might wanna also say na parang 86. Okay, it's an effect. Diba? Parang from -9 to 1. I mean. Maybe democracy is reassuring. I don't know.
Political crisis was hitting the regime just when it was at its weakest economical, may pagka-French Revolution ng dating, like parang Tocqueville level na ito. But bro, yun nga, like my point is, if there was a much more sustainable economic model in 70s pa lang, that would have put you in a better position to withstand things in the 1980s, as a lot of Southeast Asian countries did, no? I don't know, or even to withstand if you had strong state institutions, kung hindi ganun ka-cronyist and corrupt, then a political crisis would not have had such an compounding effect in terms of your economic output. You get what I'm saying? Like look at Thailand, sobrang wasak yung politics nila, right?
Yeah.
And yet they're still growing 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%. I mean, nakailang kunang Thailand. Like Thailand, bro, had like 19 coups, right?
Okay.
Yet their average growth is higher than us. Kaya nga, that's what I'm saying. You have to show to me the exact nexus between I mean, I get it heuristically, but we have to show it na why our system is so political instability susceptible in terms of our economy, no? While we have neighbors who are like wasak din. You had genocidal situation in Indonesia in the mid-1960s, and then 1998, of course, ibang usapan niya. So, I don't know. I'm just saying, bro, no? Na I get where you're coming from, but the comparative political economist in me looks at Thailand, looks at Indonesia, looks at this kind of like those guys had pogroms. Those guys had multiple coup d'etats. So interesting. Like, was there something specially devastating with the political fallout that really made our economy so fragile?
Well, Sikat. I'll give you Gerardo Sikat's answer, which is that the reforms in the 1970s came in too late. They should have come in the 50s.
I get that. Like,
so
it's
effectively
convenient, but it kind of made sense also. I get it, yeah.
Effectively, the blame is on, and I'm sympathetic to this because I hate the guy. You blame Miguel Codero, because he refused to reform. He refused to create
I see where this argument is going.
He refused to create a robust export processing base that would have been strong in the 60s. Because Sikat's argument is really the takeoff point that made robust economies in Asia happen in the 60s, and that's because there were depreciations in the 50s. Okay, right. So if you look at Taiwan, for example, the 40% depreciation of the Taiwanese currency,
Taiwanese dollar.
The 40% depreciation of the Taiwanese dollar happened in the 1950s. And then the export orientation kicked in the 60s. So Sikat's argument is that if you had a depreciation in the 50s, export orientation in the 60s. In other words, you shift from ISI in the 50s to EOI in the 60s, export orientation in the 60s. You have a solid export manufacturing base, and then you just deepen that in the 70s, and you're more prepared for the 80s. This is the Sikat argument. And if you look at some of the data, so merong lecture si Don Paderanga where he says, kailan tayo naiwanan ng Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And Don actually, based on yung kanyang comparative takeoff points model, sabi niya 60s na overtake na tayo. So I think this is very crucial that Cayetano Paderanga makes the exact same argument as Gerardo Sikat. Why? Because you're not going to believe Sikat dahil pro-Marcos siya. Si Cayetano Paderanga was the NEDA chief of Cory and Noynoy. So it's someone, in a way, from the opposite side of the spectrum, making the same argument. So my sense is that you cannot just dismiss Sikat's argument. Of course, part of that is like, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't Marcos do anything about the crony capitalism that was already building up in the 70s, right? That's partly Sikat's way of washing his hands of that. And in fact, Sikat has a line where he says that the crisis of the 1980s has been unfairly reduced into a crisis of crony capitalism. Sikat, you might wanna reassess that because but then again, he also has a point, right? This is just a classic liberal in me. Everyone has a point.
So ganito, essentially the argument is this, that a lot of our economists now who are very critical of Marcos are overlooking the deeper source of the rot, which was actually the 60s, right? You're saying
and then, sorry, let me make a point, another point in defense of Sikat. Sikat did not just make that point in he made that point in 1984, and Professor De Dios cites him making that point in 1984. Now, if you cite Sikat making that point in 1984, it sounds like an excuse because 84 na in the height of the crisis. But I looked for the first times, I tried to look for the first time Sikat made that argument. I found Sikat making that argument in 1968, a full 2 years before he joined the Marcos administration. And for me, that's telling that
I remember that. You said that earlier.
It's effectively a lifelong argument that he's made. So I'm willing actually to take him. I'm willing to extend to him some level of good faith in making that argument. That it wasn't purely just an excuse.
Bro, I mean, I don't know if you saw yung Journal of Democracy piece ko on the Philippine democracy. I make a very similar argument also on the political front, that the rot in our political system is very 50s and 60s. That's why you had the Marcos, except Marcos made it worse. So the idea of blaming it all on Marcos and completely overlooking the rot in the apple from the 50s and 60s is kind of, you know what I'm saying, problematic. Treat Marcos as trouble in paradise. That's a big problem. In the same way that when Duterte won, you'll say, oh, we had perfect situation. Duterte came and ruined it. It's like, what perfect situation? Maybe for you, the middle class, upper class Filipinos, but that was not the case for average for the masses, etc. So I get what they're saying, that this idea that it was Marcos who ruined what was supposed to be a pretty decent long-term trajectory is not true, because the rot in the apple was much deeper than the Marcos era. But not to excuse Marcos. Obviously, we are looking at the data and we're just saying it's an incomplete picture of Philippine economic landscape. So I see where you're coming. Because I was wondering, it's like, what is Lelo trying to say here? It's like, and then kinonek mo dun sa, no, the rot was actually in the 1560s. We didn't do it earlier, kaya too late in the 70s, kaya messed up in the 80s. Like, okay, I see where you're coming from. And to be honest, I'm sympathetic to that argument. Even on the political front, I feel we're putting a lot of blame on Marcos, not explaining why Marcos came into being to begin with, right? I think Benedict Anderson Cooper. Benedict, I don't know. Benedict Anderson, I think, had a pretty decent idea on that. No, bakit Supreme Cacique, because there was already rotten Cacique at the moment. I get it. Okay, I see where you're coming from.
I mean, absolutely, you're right. So, for example, yung 1917 economic crisis ng 1970, where you had to depreciate the peso dahil sobrang laki ng electoral spending. The first that already happened in 1958, and I was looking at this book. Actually, I'll show you. You can some of you might still be able to find this. These are the documents of the United States National Security Council of the Philippines. They were talking about the 1957 election where Carlos P. Garcia got elected. The tone is exactly the same tone relative to the 1970 election. In other words, gumasta si presidente. Sobrang nag-hyperinflation, hindi naman hyperinflation, sobrang tumaas ng inflation dahil gumasta si presidente at na-compromise yung foreign reserves. It's exact what Garcia did in 1958 is exactly what Marcos did in 1970. So am I saying Marcos is not rotten? No, it's not. He's absolutely rotten. But Garcia was rotten in the 1958 election also. Quirino was rotten in the 1953 election as well. You get similar kind of like economic changes in in all those electoral years, 1953, 1957, 1970. And I'm sure if you looked at 1965, you'll find something similar, except di ko pa naaral si 65.
No, I see what you're saying. Like, yeah, for me, there seems to be a blind spot, no, in the critique of both Duterte and Marcos, both Marcos for that matter now. Some are conveniently, or some I think are, intellectually, deficiently overlooking the roots of a lot of crises and problems we're facing right now. Kaya nga meron tayong this culture of voter blaming because you're not explaining the roots of where this problem.
Yeah. Oh yes. Yeah.
Let's be honest,
Can you explain
bro.
that? Can you explain that? Can you go through the logic that why does our failure to analyze the system as a whole lead to voter blaming? Because I think people need to understand this.
Exactly. If you treat the whole Duterte Marcos phenomenon as a kind of trouble in paradise, so your presupposition was things were good, and then people were fooled by these Pied Pipers, and then so you were ungrateful and you didn't see what is good, and then you went for something wrong, and then you insisted on that. The problem with that is you end up blaming the voters and saying that you didn't see facts for facts, when in fact the voters felt the facts, which was lack of inclusive development on the ground. whether it's the 1960s or whether it's the 2010s. Let's just be brutally honest about it. I just see consistently this problem. So that is where I feel this is less social science. This is more partisan argumentation. It's a partisan argumentation based on good facts, but kind of cherry pick facts or kind of decade specific facts, right? Rather than history driven facts. You get what I'm saying? So I appreciate what you're doing, because in parallel, I've been doing the same in terms of political analysis, right? Which is like, hey, we're forgetting the 50s and 60s, the rot of that. We're forgetting the lack of inclusive development. We're forgetting about the democratic deficits prior to Duterte coming to power, and by extension, Marcos Jr. So what you're saying is that economically, we can also make a similar argument, etc. I mean, siguro, I'm more critical than you on the econ front. Like I have for me, because I look at the full development model. Maybe I was too influenced by how Asia works, among other works. Na parang, I just never saw it as a developmental state to begin with. So I kind of disagree with that idea na you just call it crony capitalism because it was a failed developmental state. No. The model was deficient because there was no what you call reciprocal mechanism or benchmark funding and crediting of the cronies. But nevertheless, we may have some disagreements here and there, but I get what you're saying. You're saying you're forgetting the 50s and 60s. And this is your unique contribution, bro, which I appreciate. You point out the specific person behind the problematic economic models we had, over which Marcos tried to create another problematic model, or some reforms that didn't work because the foundations were already weak. That's where I appreciate, and that's where I appreciate your book.
Actually, ako naman medyo bastos lang naman ako. I just named him, pero hindi naman ako yung nauna dyan. If you look at Don Paderanga's research, if you look at Sikat's research, if you look at the research of Intal, if you look at the research of Raul Fabella, they all say that the overpriced currency in the 1950s led to our downfall as an export-oriented country. That's very common. Even the history of the central bank says, even the official history of the central bank says, we missed out on export opportunities because of the overpriced currency in the 1950s. Ang contribution ko lang naman dito ay maging bastos, which is to ask, who did that? And the answer is clearly Miguel Cuaderno. So dapat talaga, siraan yan kasi siya hindi kasalanan. We need to be a bit more bastos.
Kasi si Araneta ang idol mo eh. Kasi idol mo si Araneta. He's related ba to Liza Araneta? Are there like...
I think maybe malayo. Pero I've also...
related tomorrow, Hus.
Yeah. I think so, pero malayo na. But
I'm just sutiling you, bro. I'm just sutiling you.
My real economic hero is Salvador Araneta. So I really think he deserves vindication.
Just to be clear, guys, Leloy won an international award, next level, academic award. Hindi lang mga basta-basta academic award for a fantastic book. Can you tell to our audience again? I actually recommend it to my students. Liberalism and Post-Colonialism.
I
made chapter I didn't find it sexy enough. I don't. Maybe it's just me. Like I felt I could make the title sexier because the content.
Well, my next book. Tell me if you like the title. It's called "The Profligate Colonial: How the United States Exported Austerity."
Okay, that's you. That's your genre, bro. It's so Leloy. I mean, like honestly, like immediately Leloy yan. Like that's good. There's because I have a Haydarian way of framing things. So I'm not because I'm a journalist. Also, I can do. No, I mean I like it. Bro. That's good. Parang sige lang. I just want liberalism and post-colony. It's like I don't know. It sounds very academic, but the way you wrote it is the prose is beautiful and engaging. So
there was a kind of bait and switch there. I wanted an academic audience, but I wanted to please an academic audience, but make them think that it was like a kind of almost theoretical meditation on post-coloniality. But then but then the side of me that I really wanted to show there was the side of me that wrote profiles for Esquire Philippines and Rogue Magazine. That's my side.
And that's, I think, where we're kindred spirits, right? Like we can shift voices. Like I can write like textbook political science, and then I can write, Balahura, and then I can be I can be Bardagulan, and then I can tweet, right?
Genre lang.
Exactly.
Gusto mo bang after that with that context?
Tapos na to episode na to. So the next episode, very short, we'll talk about I want to wear camouflage because we're going to talk about Sarah Paul, Romualdez, Bardagulan. All right? We're gonna talk about it.
Okay.
So very quickly, palit lang tayo, bro. Next episode, make
Sige.
it short. But thank you very much.
Thank
Len,
you.
I appreciate that. I know that your heart is into this, and I like what you're doing. Kasi ako, ang joke about myself is, para akong Hegel, I keep on writing the same book lang, like the Occupation of Hegel.
Ako rin. Oh.
Ikaw naman, parang may pagka ganon, and then parang villain origins, spin-off, and then like, may ganon ka rin. So, but I can see a direct line from post-colony liberalism book mo to the next one, right? I'm just saying.
Oh, salamat.
Negosyo lang, bro. Sige. Alam mo na tayo.
Sige. Okay.